to our online community that is joining us from every corner of the globe. I hope you're all doing great. I just wanted to take a moment to, well, first I'll introduce myself. I'm the Director of Advancement here. Also, though, I think, most proud to be a member of Harvard Extension School's classes of 2000 and 2013, where I did an ALB and an ALM. Completely life-changing. And the reason I'm here and the reason I love my job is all of you. So it's wonderful to have you here. And I want to make a couple just general housekeeping announcements about our day. First of all, if it is your first time or you're watching from afar, we do this every year. This is our annual reunion, and it's different every year. So first and foremost, thank you, Nancy, but thank you, Ariel, who has just been an exceptional volunteer in helping extend our community globally around the world. Ariel is our president, but he will probably neglect to mention that he is the founder of our Midwest chapter.
Okay, Dad and I will be,
the Texas chapter. Several of you are here today, and shout out if you're online, and our Latin America chapter. So he is a very busy.
Dad and I will be probably at where the White Bakery is.
Loving individual that we are so grateful for every day. Thank you, Aaron. Wonderful. Well, part of this weekend, our reunion, that has been one of the favorite, cherished aspects is being back in the classroom. I don't know if any of you took a class in this very room. I know I did. So the sentimental value of being back in a classroom. But to Nancy's point, I think one of the really strong binders in our community is the desire to learn and to stay on the cutting edge. And I'm really excited to get to introduce Shawn O'Connor. And I am going to read a bit about his bio. I can tell you that he is one of the highest reviews faculty members we have here in Extension, and he's joining us from Dallas, Texas, came in just for this. So we are honored and thrilled to have him, and I'm gonna wear my readers because again, he's got a great bio. Okay, so Shawn O'Connor is a management consultant, serial entrepreneur and academic. Having previously worked with McKinsey & Company, he's the founder and CEO of Locus Strategy Consulting. Now, in 2006, Shawn launched Stratus Prep, an educational consulting firm, which grew to approximately 100 team members serving students in 50 countries. Moving on from that and selling it, he has taught graduate business courses in management, consulting, strategy, marketing, and business law at various universities, including our fair Harvard, where Shawn has won 2 Dean's Commendations for distinguished teaching. And Shawn has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a JD from Harvard Law School. But, truly, he has impacted the lives of thousands of our students with his professional development programs, the Consultants Toolkit, starting and building a consulting business, an LGBTQ+ leadership program, Leading with Pride. So thank you, Shawn. And without further ado, come on up.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here in person, to meet some of you for the first time in person, as well, that we've had so many times to interact online, and to meet some of you that I didn't have the pleasure of teaching during your time here. As Jill said, I am Shawn O'Connor. I teach in the management program. I teach strategic management, marketing management, business law, execution is everything, which is our new entrepreneurship class. As well as some different professional development programs. And so when Jill asked me to do this a few months ago, she's like, I'm sure you have some content you could use, but I really wanted to create something new, like just for you guys, right? Like I didn't want to repackage anything. I felt like, this is a big event. Some of you are graduating this weekend. This is, Extension's, annual reunion. And so I thought, if I were coming, what would I want to explore? And I thought, reunions are a chance to reflect not only on the past, but on the future. And where are things going in whatever field you're in? And we're going to cover things like sustainability and government and management in this presentation. And so I went through, I read a bunch of articles, I reflected on my own experiences, and I came up with the 10 key trends across disciplines that I thought you should be thinking about as Harvard leaders going forward in your life and career. And so that is our topic for today, 10 key trends for the next 10 years. And we're going to do it in a countdown style. I can guarantee you virtually no one is guessing what number one is, which I truly believe is the number one most important trend that people are not paying enough attention to, but that we really should be paying attention to. I think a lot of you will think number two is number one, okay? But no, number one, I think will be hopefully a good surprise. Hopefully I'm building the suspense and I'm teasing it up well. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I don't need to go through my bio because Jill did a great job on that. I will say I'm now in Dallas. Those of you who've been here know that I was in Colorado and then I was in Wyoming. And so one of our trends is around digital health, and that is the space that I work in now. I am the CEO. I have no background specifically in clinical mental health myself, but I am the CEO of a new company called DWUS. It's about 2 years old. We started as online mental health resources for adolescents. As many of you probably know, there is a huge adolescent mental health crisis in the US, and we can talk more about that when we come to that trend about digital health. But there's been an interesting pivot that we'll cover that happened in retail and that is now happening in healthcare, which is the move from fully online to omni-channel, where you can get services in person when you need in person and online when you would prefer online. And so we decided, because there's a dearth of mental health resources in Texas, to open in Dallas. Texas actually ranks 50th out of 50 in access to mental health resources. And so we have some physical centers in Texas now. So that's why I'm there. So I'll just add that. All right, so these are sort of the forces that I believe are shaping the world. Some of them predictable, some of them less predictable. The way we're going to do this is I have a couple of slides on each trend. So I'll introduce the trend. I'll walk through a couple of slides, but then I want to hear from you. Okay, as you know, if you took one of my classes, we got a whole row here that's taken some of my classes. I kind of, oblige you to participate in class, right? It is not optional in my classes. I'm not going to cold call anybody this morning, but I think these will be topics that you will have thoughts, insights, and questions about. And I want to say, I do not have all the answers, okay, on any of these 10 trends. I think these are trends we all need to think about. I'll try to present the good, the bad, the ugly of each trend, some things that you may not be thinking about, okay, with some of the trends, but I invite your comments as much as your questions.
Do you want to listen? I can project it.
And Chrissy's going to help us with online contributions. So if you have a comment or you have a question and you're joining us online, I know I posted that I was doing this, and a lot of people hit me up for the link, and I was sending it out. So hopefully a lot of you guys are online with us. You can post in the chat, and then Chrissy will be your voice here in the room. And so we'll have an open discussion for maybe 10 minutes on or 5 to 10 minutes on each topic, and then we'll move on to the next trend. We will take a break for 10 or 15 minutes after trend number 6. Okay. All right. So our first trend, and this is not just paying homage because Dean Coleman is here. Okay. But there has been a real change in the concept of education. And I call this lifelong learning, anywhere, anytime. Okay. And so the concept that you just go to university for 4 years from the time you're 18 until you're 22, and then you're done, and then you go out into the world and you work for 40 years, and then you're done and you retire, that is not the way that anybody sees education today. It's not how educators are seeing education anymore. It's not how employers see education anymore. And most importantly, it's not how individuals see education. And I've got some interesting statistics. So if you look at this chart, this is from Pew Research. This is about people pursuing educational opportunities for personal reasons only, not for career advancement. Okay, so 74% of people did at least one of these things out of pure personal interest, from taking an online course to taking an in-person course to attending a conference to joining a book club. So there is still an incredible passion for people to continue learning throughout their life, not just in a transactional way because they think that it's going to help their career, but because of their innate personal creativity. right? And fortunately, there are more and more opportunities for us to be able to do that that are enabled and empowered by digital technologies. And so the global e-learning marketplace is expected to be $320 billion by next year. So, huge opportunity to learn synchronous, asynchronous, and really we are just starting, we're really at the forefront of this change, right? Because if we think AI is going to allow you to have personalized education, right? You're going to be able to specify, I want these specific tools, or I want to be able to put myself in a position for this specific role, or I want to, be able to assist my family in this specific way, because it's not only going to have to be business related or professional or career related. And then AI is going to be able to reach out and grab resources from throughout the world, video resources, text resources, courses, and help you kind of build customized curriculums around whatever your personal life or career goals are. Obviously, and we'll talk about this when we get to the world of work too, VR and AR are going to change it from, hey, we're all at our desks looking into a camera, seeing a two-dimensional version on the screen, to, hey, we can all, if we want, go and sit around a table or have coffee together and have a whole new concept of office hours, right? Where office hours really becomes much more like the in-person experience. I was talking with Dean Coleman a couple of minutes ago about this concept of kind of micro-learning too, right? So this can be certificates, but this can even be less than a certificate. This can be a micro-certificate. This can be a badge, right? And the idea that learning can be in all different sort of size increments, right? It does not need to be simply a degree or a 6-course certificate, but it can be sort of whatever you need at that time on your schedule in your way. And this is really, a dramatic shift, right? I finished graduate school in 2007 here at Harvard, and it was still very much a world of you went to school to get a degree, which was, something that then you could put on the wall and put on the resume. And, it was very much a check the box type of system. Whereas what I think is really exciting about this trend is the idea that now it's learning to actually gain skills that you can put immediately into practice in your personal as well as your professional life. And obviously we can transcend geographic and time boundaries through synchronous and asynchronous learning. So I'd love, all of you have been at the forefront of this educational revolution. So I'd love to hear your questions, your thoughts. This is our first trend. I didn't rank it. I truly ranked these. I was not trying to, like look good with Dean Coleman here. Okay, no. This was really what I thought was the 10th most important trend in the world today that as we prepare for our career in sustainability in business, we need to be aware of. And, it's not only for yourself, but for those that you're working with, that you're mentoring, right? Making sure that people understand there are all these different opportunities available to them, right? That they can do online education, that they can do hybrid education, that they don't have to commit to, entire degree programs. So questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Explain more about what the, okay.
So they can hear you.
Sure. Could you just describe multi-channel learning a little bit more in more depth?
Yeah. So, I think that people want to be able to, sort of access education through a number of different channels, and that can be live delivery, but that could also be recorded delivery. That can be asynchronous interaction. So if you think of like a Harvard course, most Harvard courses are multi-channel in that way, right? We have assigned readings, right, that you do at your time. Sometimes I assign videos, right? You watch the videos at your time and on your schedule. But then we have asynchronous interaction, right? And we use, at least in my classes, we use the Canvas discussion board for this, right? So that, hey, you can contribute ideas and others can contribute ideas, and we can have a robust discussion of topics, even if we're not all able to sit together at the same time during the week to discuss that. Now, we also have time to sit together in person, or not in person, but online at the same time, but we can continue that discussion throughout the week, right? So that the learning is not just contained to like a 2-hour class period, but rather it continues throughout the week when you're available with, your family responsibilities, your personal responsibilities, your professional responsibilities. So all of these different channels are the synchronous, the asynchronous, whether it's in person, whether it's video, whether it's audio, whether it's, reading, allowing people to, sort of gain their learning in all different ways that can adapt to different circumstances and schedules. And so that's what I think of when I think of multi-channel, is that, and it can be, you could have a course that's just in one channel, but what I find more interesting and where the learning is so much deeper is when it's multi-channel, because then it's not, oh, I do my reading, I come to class, and then I'm done for a week. Instead, I'm thinking about these topics, I'm contributing on these topics through discussions all through my week as I put these learnings into practice, perhaps at home, perhaps in the office, perhaps both. Other questions? Yeah, Ritesh.
So I'll provide a view from the real world perspective. So I work in an enterprise organization, and we provide these micro-learning components for workers. And so one of the research we did and we discovered is that workers, who are educated, they have up to 33% higher efficiency in their job. And so there are components such as contextual learning, right? And so imagine that you have to go do a task that the system tells you that, hey, check, you have to go fix such and such thing. Here is a 5-second video or 30-second video that shows you how to do it, right? We add that with augmented reality, which essentially says, okay, here, point your device on such and such thing, and here is a quick, a minute video on how to fix it, right? So my point is that the trend that you're talking about is very much alive. And just for my organization, this is about a $15 million business.
Yeah, and you see this, this is really common. Ritesh, who I've had in a couple of classes, is in the technology space, and you see this a lot in technology, right? That as we roll out new softwares within enterprises, the idea used to be you rolled out a software, you brought trainers on campus to your organization, they trained everyone, nobody really paid attention, they were there for the lunch, it was a day out of their office, right? Then they went back, they didn't know how to use it, they're having to call a help desk, right? And now that can all be done with these micro units where, hey, I need to process an expense report in this new finance program. Let me click on this 1-minute video that's going to tell me what I need to do and what I clearly did wrong because this expense report isn't generating. I watch this 1-minute video and I'm good to go and I can do that. Interestingly, CNN did a recent story about a car wash that employs almost exclusively individuals on the autism spectrum. So in mental health, people send me these things now. And this was within the last week. And this was really built by a family that had a son who was on the autism spectrum. And as he became an adult and the parents got older, they were like, we need to create a career for our child. And then this grew into a much bigger project. And all throughout the car wash, they have QR codes so that if an employee isn't sure if they need a little reminder on how to do the task that they've been assigned to do, they can just scan the QR code, watch a 30-second video, right? But this is education, right? This is education the same as sitting in a physical classroom is education. It's just, at a micro level versus a macro level. And we all need a mix of those, right? This idea that you only do it at a macro level and you retain what you retain and then we hope for the best is not where the world is today, right? The world is too complex. We need those constant reminders, those abilities to re-engage, and that's what education allows us to do. All right, one last question or comment?
Hello.
Oh, there you go.
So do you see this trend applying to pre-18 education as well? So sort of high school or secondary school? Or do you see this trend being sort of limited to undergraduate, graduate kind of spaces?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I think something that we learned during the pandemic is that younger children do benefit from the social and the in-person educational interactions that come with traditional school, right? And so, if we look at elementary education, I still think you're going to have an evolution of these kind of micro units that can be put in where the teacher covers something, but then if you go home and you don't remember how to do it, you can watch a video to remind yourself because maybe your parent isn't home or doesn't do math the way they're now teaching math, right, in elementary school. And so I still think we can leverage these components, but I think at the youngest levels of education that, we'll still have I won't say dependence on in-person, but in-person will still play an important role in a multi-channel strategy. But think about high school, right? in high school, we need to be thinking, there's been a lot in the media over the last few years about not everybody, college is not the right thing for everybody, right? And, for the first time, we're starting to see declines instead of increases in the number of particularly male high school students. We were on this steady uptick of every year, like 1 or 2% more of males and females would go and pursue undergraduate education. And with particularly high school seniors graduating from high school who are men, you're starting to see just a little bit of people not going to college, worried about the costs and things like that. With that, we can use AR and VR. Let's say you want to pursue a trade, right? I mean, now we will be able to train you to be a plumber, to be an electrician, et cetera, using AR, VR for the trades. It doesn't completely replace it, but we think of this as like, robotic surgery, right? Or training doctors, but it can be also used for training people who are going to go into the trades, which is going to be a key thing. I mean, you can't outsource services businesses that need a physical component, but you can use technology to train people who will be in the physical trades. And so as people try to figure out, is college the right choice for me as I'm graduating from high school? That doesn't mean like, oh, okay, if you don't do college, then you're going to just, be relegated to a low-paying service job, at a fast food restaurant or something. No, there's going to be a lot of other opportunities. We have a deficiency in the trades in this country right now, and we can use this microeducation, this AR, this VR to speed up that education, fill in some of those gaps. Because if you look at the construction industry, particularly in different pockets throughout the country, the biggest challenge that they face now that the price of materials has come down is the lack of trained labor to do the work, right? And so if we can use technology to speed up that process or to refresh, also as houses become more complex, we're going to need to re-educate folks, right? If you're 50 years old and you trained as an electrician 30 years ago, and now you're installing smart home systems, you're not going to go back and do an apprenticeship all over again, but you need to learn that. And so how can we create badges and certificates to help with that? So I don't think this is only undergraduate and graduate. I think, for high school students, if you want a language that your high school doesn't offer, this is a great solution for that. If we want technical education, this is a great solution for that. And it does play a role even in elementary and middle school, but I think more reinforcing what the in-person interaction in the classroom can be. All right, great. So now we jump from education to healthcare, okay? A topic that has become near and dear to my heart. And I called this the digital health revolution, but I really want to call it the omni-channel health revolution. So here's sort of all of the different ways. This is from my old friends at McKinsey. These are all the different ways in which technology can help us to get more effective healthcare. We all know that particularly in the US, healthcare is exceptionally expensive, okay? And even though it's exceptionally expensive, we still struggle in some ways with quality and interaction and the equality of access in rural versus urban areas. Okay, so those of you in the Boston area, you have some of the very best healthcare in the world at your fingertips, right? But that is not the case for people in rural Texas or rural Wyoming who have very, very limited access to care. But with this digital ecosystem, right, we will be able to provide more consistent quality of care anywhere in the world, okay? Which is tremendously exciting. And I'll just draw attention to the idea of sensors here. A company called Livongo now was bought by Teladoc. Teladoc overpaid for it, but it's a great company. They just bought it at the wrong time. If you've done my Teladoc case, those of you who've taken class with me, you know what we're talking about. Livongo, their entire business model is if you have chronic conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes, they give sensors to you that you use in your own home, okay? But that are connected through your Wi-Fi to a monitoring sensor that allows, instead of you having to have your, checkup once a month or once every 3 months with your doctor, they can right away see, is there an arrhythmia, right? Are you not regulating your blood sugar correctly? And that way it's communicated directly to their headquarters who communicates to your medical provider. And so this is an in-home constant diagnostic, a constant monitoring, okay? And this is incredibly powerful in terms of, at a low cost, providing much better care, right? Because it's less expensive the sooner that we can discover that there's something awry with your health. We can address it before it becomes a very dangerous and expensive kind of emergency situations. So this notion of sensors is huge. Obviously, we all love having, the ability to access our digital records and everything like that digitally, and that's super helpful. But if we look at this, robotics and remote surgery is another way that, say you have a condition and you are in sub-Saharan Africa and there isn't someone within 6 or 10 or 8 hours that can perform the surgery that you need given an emergent condition. We are now able to use robotics to have a trained surgeon in Boston perform that surgery using robotics in Kenya or in Indonesia, around the world. There's still some licensing issues that we're working through in terms of cross-border provision of medical care, but this is tremendously exciting as a way to allow people to not be effectively discriminated against in the quality of their healthcare simply based on where in the country or where in the world they live. Okay, blockchain is going to be able to be used to better protect patient records, right? We've all probably gotten that letter in the mail that your health records have been compromised and we're not sure what was released, and you're like, oh goodness, I hope there was nothing I don't want out there on the internet in that. But right, AI obviously is going to help, right, with diagnostics. Okay, because AI can be smarter than the average doctor, right? Because AI doesn't get tired. AI doesn't miss something, right? And so with an AI can identify patterns that the human mind may not be able to identify. And so in terms of early diagnosis of conditions or even identification of risk factors that should be taken into consideration, AI plays a huge role in that. But the last bullet that I'll put here, and this is what I think is most important, is, and I covered this in retail in some of my classes, right? There was a time circa 2000 to 2005 when we thought there will be no more stores. You just will not go to stores. Like, bulldoze all the stores, no more strip malls, no more malls at all, just bulldoze them all down, everything will be online. Turned out people kind of liked trying on clothes, okay? Like, it's kind of cool to be able to see what it actually physically looks like on you. And even though you can put it on yourself, on your phone, and you can kind of see what it's going to look like, people like to feel it, they like to touch it, right? Like, there are things people don't like buying. Like, shoes can be really hard, right? Like, I have wide feet and like I order shoes online and it's like such a pain sending them back and getting in the, and so people, it turned out, liked being able to go in store, right? And Best Buy was sort of the leader in this idea. There's a famous HBS case on Best Buy of omni-channel, right? I can order online, pick up in store. I can see it in store, but have it delivered, right? And then COVID sort of forced everybody to get on that bandwagon, right? And so now you can order from Target and pull up and they'll bring it out to your car, or they'll bring it to your home through Shipt or whatever, okay? Well, the same is happening in healthcare, okay? And so if you look at One Medical, which is one of the great success stories, at least business success stories in healthcare, and true confession, I am a member of One Medical, so I guess I have a little bias, but One Medical is a concept of primary care. They call it concierge medicine because they do charge a small annual fee. I think it's $175 a year or something, not one of these crazy outrageous fees that some concierge providers charge. But basically, you're in their ecosystem and you can do things in person when you want. And they have, maybe 30 different metro areas, including Boston and Dallas and New York and Philadelphia, et cetera. And you can go in person and you can see a provider, or you can do, like, I came back from a vacation and I thought, like, my skin was yellow and I'm like, oh my gosh, I was in a tropical place. What crazy disease do I have? And, I took a picture and they're like, no, that's just sunburn. It just hasn't turned red yet, but it's coming. Don't worry, Shawn, you'll need aloe tomorrow. And so you can do video visits middle of the night. You can text with your provider. You can get refills. And it turns out that that's what people want. And they want that in mental health and they want that in physical health. They want to be able to see a provider, but then if they've got a serious diagnosis, they want to use virtual to get a second opinion, right? And so One Medical ended up, in terms of the financial success of the company, it went public and then it sold to Amazon for almost $4 billion, and it's less than 10 years old. But they kind of figured out that what happened in retail of don't just close down all the doctor's offices, people still want to be able to go in person sometimes, is the same thing. You better meet people where they are digitally, and you better have the ability to provide services digitally because that's a more seamless interaction for folks, but that does not replace in-person care. All right, I'll take questions or comments on this omni-channel healthcare revolution as our number 9 trend in our countdown to number 1, which is nothing like either of these. I'm just going to keep teasing number 1. Questions, thoughts? All right, from online.
Yes, from online. How this trend of digital healthcare for accessibility intertwines with red state, rural state laws that criminalize doctors and nurses for caring for patients. That was a question, but I did not read it like a question.
That's okay. So obviously, you know, around certain hot button, you know, medical topics specifically, you know, we can think about access to reproductive care and abortion, also access to care, transgender care. These are kind of the 2 hot button issues that some states, more conservative states, are regulating. Obviously, I believe, and you know, I've tried to present just different sides of each of these trends, but the US is a bit antiquated in that we have 50 different states, and to provide medical care, to provide legal care, or legal work, you have to be licensed in the individual state, right? Which is kind of odd in the 21st century, right? But you know, if you are a licensed provider in Texas, for example, you are then bound when treating a patient in Texas by Texas law, right? You can't say, oh, like I'm sitting in California in order, and we have this issue with our mental health startup. Everybody who's treating a patient in Texas needs to be licensed in Texas. It does not matter where the provider is, it matters where the patient is. Wherever the patient is physically logging in from, the provider has to be licensed in that state. And so hopefully we can work towards at least a more consistent reciprocity, right? You know, there's an issue here where states make a lot of money off of these licensing fees, and so they are hesitant. But you are beginning to see some movement in this direction. So for example, PhD level psychologists, so not master's level mental health clinicians, but PhD level psychologists, they've got almost 40 states now that will do reciprocity through something called PsyPAC with a PSY, like psychologist. And so basically you apply to PsyPAC, you pay a bunch of money, they validate your license in one of the 40 states, and then you're able to see patients in any of the 40 states. Social workers are trying to now get the same thing for master's level social workers, but really as a country, we need to move towards getting this for MDs, for nurse practitioners, for PAs, right? Because in a world where you want to be able to see the specialist that you need, and the fact that the person is at Brown and not here, right? Like, why should I have to like drive there because it's in a different state? So I have to drive to literally you hear stories of people who drive over the border into like Rhode Island, get on their phone so that then they can talk to the provider because the provider's not licensed, you know, say in Mass. These are really antiquated. So we need to look at how the regulatory landscape needs to evolve. And this will be true of a number of our trends, but the regulatory landscape needs to evolve to meet the digital possibilities, right? Yeah. Hold on, you need the mic so that they can hear online.
Yeah, so a question I have is kind of around like the historic payment structures that exist in healthcare, and like as you shift into like these more hybrid models, like how does a provider or a group actually start capturing payment for these services, which historically like a health insurer would pay for under a really strict like, hey, you go in and this is your encounter.
Right. So full disclosure, everybody, Louis works in digital health. So, you know, that's why he's tossing the tough questions this way. All right. So certainly we're going to need to rethink the payment model for these, because traditionally, right, at least in a what's called a PPO model, it's payments based on procedures or payments based on interactions. So you go to the doctor, you spend 10 minutes with the doctor circles the code for a 10-minute or less visit, and they bill the insurance for that, right? Or you go in for an annual physical and you spend 60 minutes and they bill for that time. How do you bill for when you text with me, or when you need this thing from me, or you do a video visit? And so we probably will need to, especially at the primary level, primary care level, think more about this as a relationship, right? Which is what One Medical was able to do. We have a relationship. And so we charge you something for access to the digital tools and access to the 24-hour. But then anytime you have a visit that is anything, we do bill insurance for that, right? And so this kind of hybrid of we have to charge, on a per visit or per interaction or per procedure basis, because that's still how insurance is set up. But then we need to think about this as a broader relationship and have a way of billing for that as well. And I mean, One Medical has basically proven the thesis that people will pay, almost $200 per year for the convenience of being able to interact with a provider in this way, so that they can get the care at the time and in the way that is more convenient to them, right? That their time is worth that much. But certainly, we will need to navigate, and, providing care digitally is cheaper. So insurance will want to do that, right? There is an incentive for insurance to provide care digitally, because you don't have overhead costs, et cetera. So, but this will take, and insurance executives are always not the most creative of thinkers when it comes to, how can we do things. I mean, they're very good at being efficient, but they're not necessarily good at, sort of opening their minds. And that's going to have to be something where providers, technologists, and insurers will have to kind of come together with regulators to make that happen. All right. Yeah. Last question on this trend. Yeah, it's come.
So the question about cost savings and efficiency is what was coming to the fore of my mind regarding the incredibly unsustainable rise of healthcare in the United States, because we spend twice as much as a share of gross domestic product as the average OECD country. We also spend twice as much per capita in terms of people. So any way that you can reduce disparate outcomes in health and reduce overall costs, especially administrative costs, and you get away from capitated care, you get away from pay for procedures, which just incentivizes commerce. And I was thinking, how will we arrest the momentum of ever rising care, or at least slow the increased cost from one year to another? And this seems like a way to do that. And the refund mechanism that's part of the American Care Act, where insurance companies have to reimburse costs not spent on administrative or healthcare services, seems like a good motivation, because if they can reduce costs, they don't have to write those checks at the end of the year.
Yep. Yeah. So obviously, healthcare in the US, tremendously expensive. It's a very, very complex issue. There are some things where the US just pays more than its fair share. So for example, when it comes to drug development costs, because of how drugs are priced in the US versus how prescription drugs are priced in other countries, the US pays way more than we should if it were proportional across the world for the development of new drugs. That's not the only contributing factor, but it is a big contributing factor. You do see, with the sort of growth of these mid-level professionals like master's level counselors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, that's going to help bring the cost down. Digital certainly helps bring the cost down. Another thing that I think you're seeing just, sort of the first, just the forefront of is value-based care, where now instead of paying per procedure, we basically pay you based on results. Right. And so, for example, they'll look at, okay, you're doing a knee replacement. How many of those people had to be readmitted for an infection? Okay. Not uncommon with knee replacements. A few percent of people have to be readmitted for infections. Now insurers are beginning to try to work with hospitals to say, okay, we're going to pay you not just X amount per knee. We're going to pay you X amount, per knee. But then if you have above this rate of infection, we're going to take some of that back. And by the way, when they readmit for the infection, that's on you. That's not on us. You need to treat that, to encourage both cost savings at the same time the quality of care goes up, which is what you want to see, right? You want to see an alignment of incentives where patients are getting better care and being less subject to, readmissions to the hospital, which no one wants. And therefore, the company pays more to that hospital than it does to the hospital that doesn't do as good a job. And therefore, you create kind of a market for good, high quality healthcare. And you're seeing this already. And I can tell you that when you renegotiate healthcare contracts for, we are kind of a mid-level outpatient facility. So more serious than just individual counseling, but not as serious as inpatient mental health. They look at what percentage of our patients have to come back to a program like ours? What % of our patients have to go inpatient? It's never going to be zero, right? Because people are, people are all unique and have different challenges. But they definitely, more and more data, and this is where big data fits in, allows us to figure out who's really providing demonstrated higher quality of care. And we encourage people to pursue their care there because it's a better value, it's better for the patient and better for the insurer. All right. So now we jump to sustainability. And I want to talk about renewable energy. And specifically, we're going to focus a bit on solar because a lot of people talk about wind. Not as many people talk about solar. Solar is super interesting, both with some positives and some negatives that we need to think about. So here you can see the growth in China in terms of solar capabilities. Okay, and China definitely leads the world when it comes to solar capacity, which is great. And we're going to have, I'll give you a hint, one of the last 3 or 4 is climate change. And so we will get to revisit this topic later. But solar seems like a great idea, right? Like the sun's always going to be there. There's lots of areas like where I live in Dallas where you have a lot of sun a lot of the year. It's very intense. You can take advantage of it. But what I want to postulate here is that just because it's renewable doesn't mean it's always great or perfect or ideal. And so, not trying to pick on China in any way, but because they are by far the leader in solar, there are some things we need to think about with some lessons learned from China's solar experiment. Okay, number one, where you put solar farms matters. Okay, because you need vast expanses of land to generate enough solar power. And China mostly generates its solar power in Western China, okay, which is where the Uyghur population is, for example, that we heard about around the Olympics, et cetera. And there has been a lot of controversy of, do you take huge vasts of land from native peoples who then are sort of removed from this land because it's in a great region for solar and it appears that there's not a lot built up already, but this can be very ethically questionable in terms of relocating native peoples who've been in these areas for hundreds or thousands of years. So that's one question that has come up in terms of the huge explosion of solar, because basically in Western China, you have a lot of sun, right? You're kind of near South Asia. You build these huge solar farms. There's not a lot of people. And then you take all of that electricity and they ship it to Shanghai and Beijing and the other large coastal cities. But that has been somewhat controversial. So as we think through sustainable energy, there are other topics that come up. We need to go to sustainable energy. There's no doubt about that. But it's a complex issue that we need to think about. Another issue is the world wouldn't have solar power without China because they are able to produce solar panels at such a lower cost than anywhere in the rest of the world. But that also has raised some other sustainability questions because unlike wind, solar panels have a lot of actually quite dangerous materials that are used in the manufacturing process. And so you have seen that China kind of owning this industry has actually done a lot of degradation to land and water, particularly because of all the hard metals that go into solar panels, worker exposure to some of the other chemicals that are used in the manufacturing process. So I kind of wanted to include this trend because these issues are just starting to percolate up. It used to be that everybody was like, renewable, renewable, we got to fight climate change, which we do. This is not to postulate that we don't need to fight climate change, but we can't just say, oh, if it's renewable, it's perfect, right? And there are no questions, let's go full board. It's not oil, it's not natural gas, it's not coal, it's great. We need, now people are just, and I've just been reading a lot about this in the last year or two, and so I wanted to tag this as number 8. We're making good progress, okay? Today, coal is still the #1 source of energy worldwide, but as of next year, renewables in total will surpass coal. So coal is obviously a very problematic fuel source from a climate change perspective, and I'm not in any way defending coal, to be clear. But as renewables now are playing such a big role, we do need to think about what are the ethical, the social, and the environmental responsibilities as we pursue renewable, because not all renewable is equal, and also renewable is often a trade-off. That we are getting the benefit of combating climate change, which is, one of the top 3 or 4 trends that I see as a huge threat to society going forward. But as we do that, we need to also pay attention to the costs that can come with some of these renewables. Now, there's some hopeful news. Wind, okay, is now, so you have a lot of states, Texas, Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas, that their entire economies were based on fossil fuels, some mixture of oil, natural gas, and coal, right? And originally there was a lot of resistance to replacing carbon-based fuels with renewable energy sources because of the threat to the local economy, right? Because it's great to fight climate change unless I'm going to lose my job, right? Which is understandable, right? Like people have kids, they have food to put on the table for their family. It's not that they don't care about the earth, but they are dealing with a very kind of micro level crisis versus a macro level concern with climate change. What's been really awesome and is happening in the US is now Texas is the #1 producer of wind energy in the US by far. Okay. They now produce almost as much energy from wind as they do from fossil fuels. Okay. And if you look at all of the big states, if you look at the top 10 wind producers, they almost all perfectly overlay with the top 10 fossil fuel producers in the US. And so this is a case where renewables from an economic standpoint is aligning very nicely. Because if there's going to be a decrease in income from fossil fuels in these states, if we can replace that with wind, which you might say, but like these states are encouraging wind. They're not encouraging wind, but private landowners who are like, how do I now make money, are putting up wind turbines because it's the way to replace that income, right? And so you see this all the way from the Dakotas through the Rockies and the Plain States all the way down to Texas. So this has been incredibly promising. Fusion is just at the very forefront, and there's 2 different versions of fusion, a greener fusion and a blue fusion that's not quite as strong. But then there are other ways that we can address this, such as smart grids, right? But what I wanted to include here was a lot of potential in renewables, but don't just put it in as like, oh, this is the good bucket and fossil fuels is the bad bucket. Because as we learned from the example in China, there can be concerns in the renewable buckets as well. And those concerns can be environmental, social, and economic, right? And so as we think through this problem going forward, it's a little bit more nuanced, which is kind of my theme for the day. All of these trends, what I kind of wanted to hopefully spark in your thinking is that, oh, wow, like I thought of it just as like sort of this way, but now actually I can see how there's different components and it's a little more complex, and we need to kind of play with all of these different factors as we address that. So thoughts about renewables, questions about renewables? Well, you got to wait for the mic.
Come on.
So my question revolves around the equal marginal principle in economics. And so one thing I see with clean energy in particular is that there's really no acknowledgement that the resource itself is underpriced. And the more energy we produce, right, the cheaper the energy gets. We're just, are we still going to use it ineffectively, right? Should energy be actually much more expensive? And, do you see the arithmetic really working out on the pace of change, given all that?
So I think the controlling mechanism is, and those of you who've taken my class, I don't believe in an unbridled free market, but I generally believe in the free market. The good news is nobody wants to pay more for your electric bill than you have to. Like nobody, like there's no like special badge of honor for paying more for your utilities, right? Like you don't get like a nice, there's nothing that you get to wear or show people that you paid more for your electric, right? So naturally people will want to spend less, and companies will want to spend less on energy to the extent that they can, right? That this is an area that people look to cut costs. And so with smart grid technology, where we don't have to have as much production because stuff isn't wasted and we can redirect energy, I think that is something that's going to be helpful. Certainly smart homes is something that has been incredibly helpful, so that you're not heating your home all day or cooling your home all day, but instead you're pinpointing around your usage and being more thoughtful around that. Certainly AI is going to create a lot more possibilities for limiting the use of energy. But then there are things on the other side of this, like you know, I'm sure you've almost all read, if you've read anything about crypto, it's tremendously unenvironmental, okay? Crypto consumes just crazy amounts of energy. And so that is something that we need to think about. You know, crypto you will not find on the list because neither will you find the metaverse, because I think that they are both topics that would have made this list 5 years ago, but don't warrant being on the list anymore. Because while crypto is an asset class that some people will use to save money or invest money or whatever you want to call it, I don't know that it's truly investing. It's not something, you know, we're not all going to pay for our coffee in Bitcoin. Like it's that promise is not happening, right? And so while there are areas where there is like sort of energy usage, I don't think that we need to intentionally overprice energy. I think if we allow energy to be priced at, you know, market rates, and, you know, what will happen is renewables are still in almost all countries subsidized. So as we pull back those subsidies, the cost of energy will go up, right? And so the idea of renewables is that you use subsidies to take offline the coal, right? Because it's like once you take the coal offline, it's not easy to turn the coal plant back on, right? So you use the subsidies to turn off the energy that is most, you know, most carbon producing. And then you have everybody on renewables, but then you slowly remove the subsidies and then renewables will come to a market price that will end up for a time being more expensive than coal. As we continue to innovate, it will eventually become the same or lower cost than coal, which is the cheapest of the carbons. So the idea is that, you know, you will see, like right now, renewable is below the cost, but typically, you know, most people's electric bill is a hybrid. So it's not like you're paying for electric, right? You're not paying specifically for renewable. You can opt in to pay more for renewables and stuff like that. But basically you're getting some solar, some, you know, depending on where you are in the country. Like if you're in the West, you're still getting some coal. If you're in the rest of the country, you're not getting any more coal, but you're still getting natural gas, et cetera. And so, you know, I don't think we need to like inflate costs to force people to control energy. I think that will kind of naturally happen as we move through this conversion. One more question on renewables. Yeah, we'll take one from online.
Systems of redundancy would be a natural requirement in respect to national disasters and potential international threats, as well as cyber threats, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, so you know, I'm not originally from Texas. I take no allegiance in being from Texas, but as we all learned when Texas had its freeze a couple of years ago, they've decided not to be connected to the national power grid, unlike the other 49 states, which are all connected, right? And so you certainly want to be connected and you do want to have redundancies, right? Because, you know, what happened in Texas is they had a freeze, which they rely on solar, they rely on wind. Both of those went offline during this event. And they didn't have enough power. And normally in the country, we can just redistribute power from the Northeast to the Southeast or wherever we need power. But when you choose not to connect to the grid, that becomes a problem. So certainly we need to have redundancies and we need the ability with a smart grid to move power through different parts of the country so that we can always, you know, meet the needs. And eventually this will become global. And, you know, right now the US exchanges power with both Canada and Mexico, more so with Canada because they have a lot of hydro that they don't use. They don't need that energy because they're 1/10 our population. So some of that comes down and actually helps to fuel New York. And so, you know, that is definitely, we need redundancies. There's no doubt about that. And we need to be prepared for natural disasters. But with a smart grid, that's not saying you don't have redundancies, right? It's just saying you don't need as many redundancies because you're able to more quickly redirect energy as it's needed. All right.
Would you?
So let's keep going because you guys are participating so much. I don't want to, you know, I tease number one. I got to make sure we have time to get to you, right? So, all right. So next we move into demographics. And so this is a huge change in terms of the demographics of the country. And, you know, what gets reported a lot is that a figure that I have, I think, on the next slide. Actually, it's 2 slides up. So what you hear a lot is by 2045, we're going to become a majority minority country, right? That non-Hispanic whites will be less than 50%. And that is true, okay? But I would postulate that this is really the trend to pay the most attention to. The African-American population as a percent of the overall population in the US has been pretty steady for the last 50 years at around 11 to 12% of the population. And while there are increases due to both birth rates and especially immigration in South Asian and Asian communities within the US, like the big elephant in the room when it comes to the demographic change in the US that I think just kind of gets lumped into this majority minority argument is the huge explosion of the Latinx population in the US, which has far-reaching and really interesting and enriching impacts on the nation as a whole. So if you look here, I mean, we're basically talking in the last 20, this is 23 data from the Census Bureau, you're looking at almost a doubling from the year 2000 to the year 2022. Right? When the population in the country is only growing by 1 or 2% a year, a doubling in the Latinx population, right? And there's many different demographic explanations for this. A little bit of it is immigration, but also higher birth rates within the Latinx population versus the general population in the US. But this is going to have huge impacts for the country as a whole. And something to note here, let me just get to the next slide, is the Latinx population in the US is not monolithic at all. And I think that is what is probably the biggest takeaway, is that you have Latinx members of the populace who don't speak Spanish, okay? You have newer arrivals. You have folks who've been here in Texas since Texas was part of Mexico 150 years ago, right? You have Latinx Republicans, Latinx independents, Latinx Republicans. You have Catholic and evangelical and Jewish and non-religious Latinx populations, right? Throughout the country. And so it's really important that as whether you're a marketer or you're a business leader or you're a nonprofit executive, that you're really understanding sort of the huge tectonic shift in the size of the Latinx population over the last 20, 30, 40 years, because it is what is driving us towards this majority minority population. And sometimes we look at this through maybe too broad of a lens, and we're not sort of fully understanding that like this is predominantly driven by the growth of the Latinx population. Other populations are growing, but they're just either so much smaller or in the case of the African American population, growing at a much, much, much slower rate, that this is really dynamic. And this is going to, lead to a lot more of a cultural fusion, okay? That I think we're already seeing and that we will continue to see. It also will create an increasing closeness between, just a natural affinity between the US and Latin America that will have far-reaching economic impacts, okay? And our last trend will touch on this. Our next trend, the last one before the break, I should say, our next trend will touch on this in that, I'll just give it away, Mexico has replaced China as the leading trading partner with the US. And some of that has to do with some other factors that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but part of that has to do with just a closer cultural affinity between the United States and Latin America as a result, just like the US has always had an affinity with Ireland, for example, or an affinity with Italy because of large Italian American populations or large Irish American populations in the US. Similarly, this trend is likely to play out of a much closer relationship between the US and particularly Mexico and Central America, okay? This will also continue likely to be influenced by some trends in Latin America that we'll get to in another trend that's upcoming. But, we need to be really understanding like how profound, the numbers are here, and that it is really a doubling of the population, which is going to change everything from what people eat to the use of, the use and importance of Spanish language television to crossover artists between Latin music and Anglo music. I mean, this is a massive trend that is not new news to our marketing friends. Our marketing friends have been focused on this for quite some time, but this is something that I think, we really need to kind of zoom in a little bit more on, because people don't necessarily sort of look at, okay, yes, we are a country that's becoming more ethnically diverse, but it's really becoming more Latinx, right? Yes, it is becoming more ethnically diverse broadly, but the rainbow, all the stripes of the rainbow aren't equal. One of them is getting really quickly, and that is the Latinx population, and something that we need to appreciate. And we need to look at, and this comes into, with education, what do we do in terms of, do we offer bilingual education, and how do we approach that, and things like that. And just a word of sort of a caveat here, like if you're thinking, hey, maybe President Trump comes back and becomes president again and we shut down the border, like that doesn't matter, right? When you've already got 63 million Latinx folks, the number of people crossing the border in an undocumented status is like 1 million per year. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's like, it's a footnote, right? This is just over time. There have been a growing number, some of whom have been here. As I said, there are 7 generations in Texas of Latinx Americans. But this really has much more to do with birth rates than purely immigration. And turning off or closing down immigration doesn't affect this trend line in any meaningful way. Okay, I'm not taking either position on the border, right? I'm not here to talk politics with you guys, but I just want to say, like, as a student of this trend, whether there's an additional 500,000 to 1 million people who come through the border each year or not, when you're talking about a population that's growing at 4 or 5% per year, and is already at 63 million, that's kind of irrelevant, right? So questions about the growth of the Latinx population in the US and kind of the importance of paying attention to this trend and kind of what it means for the country. I will say the Latinx population is still underrepresented both in the boardrooms and in government, but certainly we should expect that to change, right? Because with it becoming, and the concentration of these populations are in a few states, right? And so while of course there are Latinx folks in all 50 states, you have huge groups of sort of powerful groups in California, in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, in New York, that are going to really influence politics in those states as well as business. All right.
So as I look at this chart, I just want to say that I'm partly responsible for it. I have 3 kids. So you're welcome.
Doing your part.
You're doing my part in this graph. I'm there. My question, though, one of my concerns that I have with our population is that the access to education, it's lacking. If I remember the numbers correctly, the number of Latinos that have a college degree is 13%, which is the lowest of all the other groups. Black has 23% of Blacks, and I think white 35%, and Asian 45%, something like that. So we are growing a lot in Texas. I'm from Austin. We are 40% in Texas. We are the largest population in Texas now, but we still lack access to education. And none of our question were like, have any solution. Obviously, things like certificates and online education, number 10. But what else can we do to get that gap closed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I certainly don't have all the answers. But I think that we need to sort of meet each segment of the Latinx population where they are, because there are very different segments of the population who've been here different amounts of time, or who have been here since, forever. They've been in Texas since, basically the border move, they didn't move, right? And so people have very different experiences, and we probably need to have different solutions tailored to different particular experiences and groups. But certainly I think what you're going to see is, the country has been having a reckoning with race and with, the changing sort of ethnic makeup of the country. I think we can expect that to continue, hopefully not with some of the vitriol that has been experienced over the last few years, but obviously the idea of equal opportunity in everything, because healthcare outcomes are worse for Black and brown people than they are for white people. Educational outcomes, it's not just education, right? It's economic opportunity, et cetera. And so really being able to figure out, how do we create an equal society where everybody starts at the same starting line, and then through your own efforts and the work that you put in and a bit of luck, you end up at wherever you end up, I think is a great challenge that the country faces. But I think that we are going to see a growing number of Latinx, just as we've seen a growing number of African American leaders and Asian American leaders. I think you will see a growing number of political and business leaders from the Latinx community. It won't happen overnight, right? It's going to be an evolutionary process. But I think that will help to put the voices that we need in the policymaking rooms, in the boardrooms, in order to, create this equality, which is good for everyone, right? Like, regardless of whether you're a member of the Latinx community or not, and full disclosure, my husband is Mexican-American, born in Mexico, so I have a personal affinity to the community. But regardless, it's great for the whole country if everybody succeeds and everybody has opportunities, right? Because we all, everybody in a rising tide, everybody does well, right? And so, we should all be incentivized, create opportunities for all Americans and for really everyone worldwide. Yeah.
Hi. So actually, Ariel and I had this conversation in Austin. So my parents are from Mexico. I grew up in the United States, born in the United States. And the one thing that I'm kind of very attuned to is that, so, Ariel and I were talking about our children. I'm like, so our children watch TV and social media in English, right? And so like, there's this natural assumption like, oh, well, you're watching Univision or Telemundo, right? And they're like, no, they don't, right? So the thing that I'm really like super focused on is like how marketing is interpreted by our generation and by our second and third generation, where there's really like a lack of representation of the Hispanic or Hispanic American community on just general media, because I think the assumption is that like, well, yeah, you have your own segment, right? You have your own Univision Telemundo segment, but the reality is that my kids don't watch that at all. They watch whatever's on TV. So I'm always just very aware of that, and I'm always trying to find a way to like exploit that to some degree, right? But just your thoughts on that in terms of like how the general media kind of maybe is underrepresenting there.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say, and I think this applies to not only the Latinx community, but also the African American community, the LGBTQ plus community. It's not just that there's underrepresentation in media, but then the representations can tend to be stereotypes, right? So it's like if I ask people like name like 3 Latinx characters on, the latest, I don't know, that you've watched on a series lately, right? It's going to be, I don't know, Modern Family, right? And it's like this, very stereotypical, Latino woman who, like kind of fits all of these stereotypes. Or it's going to be Griselda, which same actress, amazing Netflix series, but again, perpetuates these stereotypes of like Latinx is always like the drug cartel leader, right? Like here, a female versus a male. And you see the same with the portrayal of African Americans being sort of, unfair and biased. So I think we've got to address both of those. Not only the lack of representation, but also when the representation occurs, is it truly showing the full diversity of a community, or is it focusing in on predetermined stereotypes? I'm not a big fan of social media. That's not in my trends. We can talk about that some other time or during the break. But I do think one of the positives of social media is that it does allow for the democratization of content creation. And what you will find is much more of an intersection of Spanish language, English language, Latinx with, sort of all other parts of the society coming together in a confluence in social media, because content creators, particularly younger content creators, do not see the rigid boundaries of ethnicity that many of us grew up with. And so they are really able to kind of bleed cultures together in a way that is truly organic. I'm not saying to like let your kids just go wild and have unlimited social media, but that is something that is beneficial, is that younger generations do not see like, oh, you're a member of one community or another. All right. Yeah.
I'm curious from a business aspect, if you think that cultural variance is the reason why the small business owners tend to be minority, because it's a family. A lot of times family is integrated in the business plan of small businesses versus, the majority currently.
Yeah, and so that's why I had, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, that's why I talked about corporate leadership roles, and really a lot of these corporate leadership roles coming out of family-owned businesses to start, right? And that creates a lot of opportunities where, even companies like Goya, which is a huge, producer of food products that are traditionally Latin American, is still a family-run, family-driven company. That you see even in larger corporate roles, you do see like when Latinx leaders have risen to the top, a lot of those have been in sort of traditional industries that have been, which it needs to be broader, right? We want Latinx leaders in all different professions and types of businesses, but I think you identify an important trend that, family businesses has been a real opportunity for many different immigrant communities as their way to step up in American society. So I'll take one more and then we'll move on to our last trend and our break.
Hey, Shawn, nice to see you again.
You too.
I wanted to tax to this one a little bit more depth to this one is Latinos are the ones starting more businesses in the US. And then another one, the Secretary of Education just made Spanish part of the official language to be on the schools. So I think that just wanted to add this one too.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say, kind of building on that is, if you're here in the Boston area, you're going to see a large Brazilian population. If you're in New York City, you're going to see a large Puerto Rican population. If you're in South Florida, you're going to see what was traditionally a Cuban community, but now a lot of Argentines and Colombians. if you're in Mexico or in Texas, you're going to see a large Mexican population in Central America, and same in California. So it's, you know, even the geographic disbursement of different populations is different. And, you know, for example, we used to have very little immigration from Argentina, but because of a lot of the trials that Argentina has had over the economic trials and tribulations, we now see a large Argentine community developing in Miami. All right, our last trend, and then a well-deserved break, is nearshoring, okay? And this is not just about the relationship between the US and Mexico, though this is how it manifests itself in the statistics. This is about the fact that during COVID, we learned that having very perfectionist global supply chains that had very little slack is not something that works in any time of stress. And so it's not just the US that's moving to nearshoring. Europe is doing the same thing. Asia is doing the same thing of, rather than having a global supply chain, let's make it a regional supply chain. This also is caused by the fact that we have an increase, and this is going to be a topic after the break, an increase in trade tensions. And so the US has, you know, put more tariffs as of just a couple of days ago on Chinese imports. And so trade tensions between the US and China, trade tensions between the EU and many other different parts of the world are making nearshoring a necessary reality, not only to protect your supply chains, but also as a matter of keeping cost of goods low because of the tax advantages through regional trade blocs like USMCA, which is the new NAFTA, or the European Union. So here you can see the statistics. This is Bloomberg through last year. Mexico surpassed China for the first time. And what's interesting, so Mexico and Canada have always been huge trading partners with the US, which you would expect, right? Like we share massive land borders with both of them. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, Mexico has a much lower cost of labor than the US. So again, it would make sense that, that we would import a lot from Mexico. We also export a lot to Mexico of highly advanced materials. But you can see from 2018, not quite a halving, but almost a halving from, you know, 23% to about 15% of US imports coming from China. You know, this is a huge reduction. And this is, again, multifaceted cause. One is trade tensions. One is the COVID impact, the stressed supply chains. But you can see really it's a game of three, right? It's Mexico, Canada, and China. All of like the European countries that we trade with in Japan and Korea are all at 5% or less, right? So again, you know, people think of like, oh, US trading partners, and they'll think of Japan or they'll think of the EU, but it's really not. It's a three-part game, right? It's Mexico, Canada, and China, with China really pulling back. And you're seeing the same thing with the EU focusing internally again, Asia focusing internally again. And by the way, this isn't just that the US is keeping China out. China is refocusing on its close-in neighbors and wanting to trade more with countries in Southeast Asia. Okay, so $615 billion of trade between US and Mexico. Obviously, having that, I put these two, I will say, I put these two next to each other. I had to move one in the rankings, but I put them next to each other because obviously having a large population of Latinx business people makes this relationship easier, right? We have far more people in the US who speak Spanish, who understand Mexican culture, than we do who speak Chinese and understand China's culture. And so that is sort of helping to fuel this relationship. Interestingly, okay, this has been great for Mexico. Okay, it's good for the US, right? Because we have a much closer, we're much more allied with Mexico. There's much more codependence. There's no like risk of, you know, imminent conflict, despite what some people have talked about bombing Mexico, which is crazy. But, you know, there's no real, I mean, you know, we have our little skirmishes or disagreements kind of, you know, like cousins or something. But, you know, Mexico has seen their currency appreciate. It has been the best appreciating currency of any major currency. The peso has gone from about 20 or 21 pesos to the dollar to now between 15 and 16, which means that when Mexicans want to buy products abroad or travel abroad, that they are having the ability to do that in a way that is pretty much unheard of in the history of Mexico. So this is not only good for the US in terms of reducing national security risk and allowing for an ease of products to enter the US more quickly and at lower cost, but it's great for Mexico as well. You know, you have a lot of technological advances. Not only there, you know, we used to think of trade with Mexico as the maquiladoras, which is right along the border, just across into Mexico. You would have factories that would be putting together automobiles and putting together computers, which you still have these. And the idea was you took the components from Texas, you brought them across the border, you used the cheap labor in Mexico to put them together, and you moved them right back across. And because of NAFTA and now USMCA, you could do that with no tariff implications. But that's not the trade with Mexico of today. Okay, central Mexico has developed really advanced manufacturing capabilities, and we're bringing in huge electric transformers from Mexico. I worked on a consulting project recently where the US, because of the growth in Texas, the growth of housing stock, we need huge amounts of electric transformers to make sure everybody can get electric to all these newly built houses. You wouldn't have been able to do it without Mexico. Okay, Mexico was fulfilling a need to get like a transformer built in the US from Philips or any of the traditional Siemens would have taken 4 or 5 years, and Mexico was able to fill the gap so that they could keep building more housing that we need, and we have a lack of housing in the country as a total. That is attributable to smart factories and cross-border infrastructure. And so we can expect that with trade tensions on the rise, and we'll talk after the break about why trade tensions might be on the rise, but with trade tensions on the rise and with concerns about global supply chains, we can expect this nearshoring to continue, the US, Canada, and Mexico to become a tighter trading unit, and really a need to put an emphasis on how can the US work well with its neighbors to the north and south, because at the end of the day, when it comes to global competitiveness, that is the hand that the US has, right? Like we are in this trading block, and Europe has its trading block, and Asia is trying to figure out its trading block situation. But it is in the interest of all three trading partners to build this relationship as strong as it can be. All right, I'll take 1 or 2 questions, and then we're going to go to a 10-minute break. Or maybe we'll just go to a 10-minute break. I guess I explained that one so well, we're good. All right, we'll take a 10-minute break. It is, it's only 10 minutes because we got 5 more trends to do here in like 25 minutes, all right? So we're going to take a break from, it's 12:14, we'll come back at 12:24. All right. So I'll only be able to take maybe 1 or 2 questions instead of multiple questions, just to keep us on schedule. All right, the changing world of work. And so here's my new, our new way of having a augmented reality or virtual reality meeting. Okay, so this is interesting. And this changing world of work, you cannot divorce the issues around the changing world of work with the generational challenges in the workplace. Okay? So what's super interesting is that Gen Z and younger millennials, so this is anybody born 1989 to now, expresses that they are the most stressed of any of the generations, which is sort of interesting because that's not typical that your youngest workers are the most stressed, because typically your senior management is experiencing a ton of stress because they have a huge amount of responsibility. So when we look at, and they showed me how to do this, so hopefully I will be able to make this work. Let's see. Oh, yeah. All right. Let's see. Oh. All right. There we go. All right. So when we look at stress levels, we can see that stress levels, the bottom is your baby boomers, 40%. The top is your Gen Z and more recent millennials. But then the green is engagement and the blue is the dark blue is burnout. So you can see that engagement's pretty standard. We don't have great levels of engagement with anybody. But then burnout is also mirroring the stress levels. So even though boomers and Gen X have been in the workforce a lot longer, they're experiencing less burnout, which is a bit odd. And they are experiencing less stress levels, but younger employees are experiencing more burnout and more stress levels. And so this presents a real conundrum, like this idea of, oh, the emerging or the changing world of work. Everybody focuses on, is it going to be great? I'm going to be able to work from wherever I want. I'll be able to work whenever I want, from wherever I want. It seems like this, nirvana, but that's not necessarily what is playing out in the workplace today. And there is this big generational divide. And I'll just, share a quick anecdote. So I manage a lot of Gen Z therapists. And so Gen Z cares a lot about work-life balance. Therapists are taught about work-life balance. So it makes my life as a manager interesting. So we have someone who was at an event, a personal event. She was off for a couple of days. And I needed her when she came back to work. I needed to be sure she could start at 8 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. because of something that we needed. So I sent her a text to say like, hey, I hope you're having a great, she was at a bachelorette party. I hope you're having a great bachelorette party. Would you be able to start when you come back on Monday, could you start at 8 instead of at 9? The reply back, okay. Not picking on any Gen Z here, no. But the reply was, Shawn, yes, I can be there. However, and now the rest of the paragraph has nothing to do with what I texted about. However, I find it really hard to have my personal time and personal space if you send me a text. So in order for me to separate myself from work, could you please refrain from texting me outside of work hours and just send me an email? Which is interesting, which I'm happy to do unless it's like an emergency, but I am going to have to say, like, if it's an emergency, I'm going to have to send you a text, like, because you're not going to check your email. Like, oh, it also said, because I always check my email on Sunday nights before I go back to work. So I'll just check everything then. Thank you. And I think there was some things sprinkled in about self-care. But then my millennial employees are, please don't email me because I don't see the email. Please text me. So now I have to have a list of these millennials want to be texted and these Gen Zs want to be emailed, right? And so, but this is part of the challenge, right? Of different generations have different ideas of what they are comfortable with because as we move towards a remote or hybrid workplace, that starts to blend the lines between personal time and professional time, right? If you're not going to a physical office where you're on the clock for 40 hours a week and that's when you're expected to do your work, to now you have a lot more freedom, but in a way you're always on because you have that freedom and we're used to contacting you at home during work hours. So why wouldn't we contact you at home during non-work hours? It makes for a messier situation. And I don't have any answers other than I will never text this person again unless it's an absolute emergency. I don't have any answers other than to say, I don't think this conflict goes away quickly. okay? Because I never, like, born in 1977, came into the workforce in 1999, would never think of telling my boss how they could communicate with me. It's just like foreign to me, as like, I just would never. I mean, you want to text me, you want to Teams me, you want to email me, you want to call me, whatever you want to do, just, you know, keep making sure those checks deposit every 2 weeks and we'll be fine, right? But obviously, you know, and, you know, a Gen Z therapist is a very specific, you know, person who's been trained in a lot of self-care, both in terms of their professional career and their life experience. But this is not going to be as simple as, oh, we're all going to put on the goggles and we'll all see each other in our VR headsets and we'll all have our staff meeting together, sitting around on fake, you know, bean bags and like, well, I'll talk about what's going on at the office today, right? It's going to be more complex than that. And so different expectations when it comes to work-life balance, different expectations when it comes to remote work, right? Evolutions as to, you know, in one way, people want more freedom. They want independent contractor opportunities. They want gig work because they like that. It's project-based work. But then on the other side, we're seeing a rise of unions again, which is very much about strict rules and, W-2 employment and benefits and things like that, right? And so there is this tension between the gig economy and freelance workplaces. 4-hour work, 4-day work weeks instead of 5, right? And does that work? Does it not work? Where do you do it? Where do you not do it? Can you do 4 times 10 instead of 5 times 8? Flexible schedules, okay? Obviously, there's going to be continued investment in collaboration tools. But this last one is these generational differences are going to continue. I'm only 47, okay? Sorry, Gen Z, you're stuck with us Gen Xers for at least 15 to 20 more years, right? And we grew up in a different time where expectations were different. And like, you're going to have to adapt some to us and we're going to have to adapt some to you. And we're going to have to make this work for the next 20 years, right? You know, hey, boomer, okay, fine. It's the boomers are moving quickly towards retirement, but Gen X has much more of a boomer mentality than a millennial or a Gen Z mentality. And they're going to be around, and for the next 10 to 15 years, they're going to be a lot of the senior leadership of organizations from business to government to nonprofit. All right. So I'll take 1 or 2 comments or questions, but we got to keep it brief. Yeah, over here.
I'm that Latino dancing salsa in Bali, Ariel mentioned earlier.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, so customer is God, as they say in Japan. I'm just wondering, with these Gen Zs, other generations having their way, it affects the customer. I live in Bali and I see other cultures really striving hard to make sure that their customers get what they want. I'm just thinking, how is this going to affect our business in the future, our economy in the future? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is Gen Z, when they're the customer, they want things exactly the way they want them, right? Because think of DoorDash, right? Like DoorDash is like the quintessential, like late millennial to Gen Z type experience, right? Like, I want these dumplings with this sauce and I want it brought to my house at this time and they better be warm and they better taste good, or if not, I'm going to post pictures and I'm going to post reviews and I'm going to contact customer support and I want my dumplings comped, right? So I hope that as Gen Z mature, because they're just, I mean, Gen Z is just coming, they're like under 30, right? Like, so they're just coming into the work world. And I think that Gen Z doesn't fully grasp yet, particularly people who don't have a business education or a management background. They don't grasp that the way their salary gets paid is based on customers continuing to partake from the business. And if customers don't partake, there is no more salary, right? They've never lived through a meaningful recession. So they've never seen high levels of unemployment as an adult, right? So they've never been impacted by these things. And so my hope is that for those who are not from a business background, who may think, oh, I show up, I do my job, and I get paid this, and if not, I can go somewhere else and do the same thing, because that has been their experience, because the job market has been so hot for so long, that we will hit a recession, right? There is always a recession coming. We just don't know when, right? It's always coming. So that they will then learn that, hey, there is a direct correlation to the work I do and the salary that I get, because if I don't keep whoever my customer is, right, happy, whether that's donors in a nonprofit or that's, students in a university or, or customers in a consumer business, if they'll begin to appreciate, right? Because older generations have been through a lot more, right? And it, if you look at millennials' experience, we were told they were going to be totally different, right? And now they all want a house in the suburbs with a kid and, only one though, but a kid. And, we were told they were never going to leave urban. They weren't going to buy a car. The suburbs were dead. And it turned out that, yeah, they did all those things a little later because they got married later, but their experience is not that different from the generations before them anymore. So I wonder if Gen Z does not undergo, not to say they will not be their own distinctive generation with their own distinctive perspectives, but they have had a pretty charmed life experience in some ways, even though they don't necessarily see that. Because they haven't faced, other than COVID, which was, hugely traumatic for everyone. And especially a lot of them were in college and it was hugely traumatic for them. But they have not had, other than COVID, a real challenge to kind of like, they have not experienced anything like, they were babies or children in 2008, right? Which was the last sort of big economic disruption. All right, we'll keep moving so I don't get behind. All right, so you knew it was going to be on the list, right? I mean, climate change, but it did not make number one. I will say that Connie came up, she had 3 good guesses for number one, but none of them was right. All right, I think number one is scary when we get there, but I think you'll be surprised. So climate change, huge problem. But this is what I want to show you, okay? We've developed a narrative right now in the US that I think is somewhat unfortunate. The narrative in the US right now has become, it's China and India's problem. They use all this coal. We got, we're doing good work, Europe's doing good work, but if we don't get China and India under control, we're never going to solve climate change. Well, if you do the data, that's not exactly correct, okay? Right, China has like 6 times, almost 6 times, between 5 and 6 times more people than the US, okay? So it is not surprising that China is the #1 highest amount of emissions in the world. But that's not a fair comparison, right? They have 1.5 billion people. The US has under 400 million people. Of course, they're going to have more emissions than the US. The fair way to look at who is responsible for this climate change problem, who bears responsibility, who needs to get on this crisis, is to look at tons of carbon per person per year, which is the statistics that we have here. Now, there are some countries, particularly in the Middle East, and I didn't put Kuwait's also up here. These are countries that when they extract oil from the ground, they burn a lot of oil off. And by burning off, or they're burning not the oil off, but a lot of times the natural gas that's embedded with the oil, it's terrible for the environment. It's called flaring. And so that's why you have a couple Middle East countries that are the worst, okay? But look at who's next, okay? Let's look inward before we go say, oh, the dirty coal in China and India is the problem. In terms of per capita carbon contribution, the US, Australia, and Canada lead the way of all of the large industrialized countries. So like, this is still a US, Canada, Australia issue. Like, just because maybe we're making more progress more quickly in some areas than China, though I showed you a lot about their solar capacity, which far outstrips the US, right? Like attacking India, India is producing less than 2 tons of carbon per person. The US is like almost 8 times that rate or 7 times that rate, right? So this idea that there's this dichotomy and that the US and Europe is doing its part and that we're moving towards electric vehicles, which by the way, China leads the world in electric vehicles, but we're doing our part with electric vehicles, with smart grids, with everything, but the developing countries are not doing their part and they continue to have really inefficient fuel sources. That is not a fair analysis, just based on the data, okay? So, the US is not doing so well, neither is Russia. We're the #2 total emitter, but on a per capita basis, we're in a pretty rough spot. You can see China, Japan, Germany are like 2/3 of the contribution per person, right? Germany, very similar economy to the US. That's how much better Europe is doing. And if you look, Germany's actually because they have the largest manufacturing capacity in Europe, they're actually one of the worst countries in Europe. If I put France on here, Spain, Italy, they're doing better than Germany. So Europe is leading the way. That part of the narrative is true. Europe is doing great in addressing climate change. But the US is not doing so great. Like we should not, and neither is Canada and neither is Australia. We should not be patting ourselves on the back. We should be looking at what we could do. Yes, do we have to hold other countries accountable? And India's #3 and China's #1. Of course, this is a global problem. We need a global consensus, a global solution. But this is not a, this narrative that China doesn't play by the rules and India doesn't play by the rules. That's not, I mean, they may not be playing by the rules, but that is not the entire cause of the problem, right? Because we all need energy, right? And in the US, we're using, even with our renewable advances, we are using a huge amount of carbon per person versus other industrialized countries. I think is there a question? Mike? Jill, sorry. I know we've got Jill running around. Just only a couple more trends right here.
Where's that?
I was thinking this climate change affected, the climate change is affected by more people working remotely, but not all professions. Not all professions would benefit by this necessarily. In some professions, you have people who can't work remotely, and the carbon dioxide, yes, that helps if more people don't use their cars and so, but how can that be solved?
Yeah, so certainly, people commuting to work is a big contributor to carbon emissions. That's one. Electric vehicles are great as long as the electric you put in the car comes from a good source. So one of the issues in China is if I'm using coal to produce electricity and then I have an electric vehicle, that's not helpful, right? Because it would be better to burn gasoline than to burn coal, okay? Now, China's, as we saw, doing pretty well on some renewables. They also have a lot of hydro, but it comes with its own issues as well, the Three Gorges Dam, et cetera. So, getting people to drive less is a piece of it, using more public transportation. But we also have to look at other contributors to climate change. And so the sort of industrial capacity is number one, okay? Like the biggest places that we could make the most change when it comes to climate change is shifting the energy needed for factories away from fossil fuels towards renewables, right? Like that is really where you can have huge impact quickly. Getting people off the roads on public transportation, that everything contributes, right? Consuming less beef is actually quite helpful in reducing carbon emissions because cows are actually quite a problem when it comes to carbon emissions, okay? They're one of the top 3 sources globally. But you are right that not everybody's going to be able to work remote and not everybody's going to have access to public transportation. So moving to electric vehicles will be helpful. Having people car share or having people use transportation or having people work hybrid where they're remote a few days, all of that will help as well. But what we really need to address is production for at-home energy use and production for manufacturing. Those are like the 2 big things that we can do to address this problem. And carbon capture is something that's interesting, still very nascent, but there's all different ideas of ways that you can capture carbon from the atmosphere and basically put it into the seabed. That's the idea. There's all different sorts of interesting things you can read about here with using algae, getting the algae, which basically takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and then you grow these huge algae farms, and then you basically you sink them to the bottom of the ocean where they decay, and it takes a really long time for the carbon to get back into the atmosphere. So that's some ideas. Obviously, different types of urban planning. There's like this whole city being built in Saudi Arabia called the Line, where everything will be along a train line. It will be huge, like 100 miles long. There's a documentary on this that you can watch. And everything, you'll work, you'll shop, you'll live all along this single train line. And it's all vertical living instead of expansive, instead of horizontal. And so that reduces a huge amount of carbon. And then obviously, we do need to all work together, come up with global agreements. Everybody needs to obey those global agreements. But, the goal of my presentation is to make you guys think, hey, let me question different narratives I'm hearing. And so I just wanted to point out that like this narrative that this is a, coal in India and China problem is not entirely. All right, so we're getting there. Number 3, populism, okay? There's populism on the right, populism on the left, okay? In the US and abroad, okay? I will say, regardless of whether it's left-wing populism or right-wing populism, in my opinion, populism is not healthy, okay? as a general rule, because populism usually looks for short-term solutions that cause long-term damage, right? So think of left-wing populism. If you remember the movie Evita, there's this moment where she's just like throwing bills of, throwing pesos at people. Okay, that's left-wing populism, right? You give people money so that they can meet their needs. But the problem is if you give out too much money, the money loses value, you get hyperinflation and nobody can buy anything, right? And all your savings has been devalued and you basically destroy your economy. So populism, whether it's to the left or to the right, is not sort of conducive to long-term stable economic growth, okay? So regardless of whether you're right wing, left wing, or center, this is not helpful for a stable and growing global economy. And what you see is, and this is from London School of Economics, is that basically right-wing populism is coming at the expense of both the center right and the center left. So it's not that the center right is moving further right, but rather that people from the right and the left are getting fed up with society in general and gravitating towards right-wing populist figures. So that's interesting, but this next statistic is really sobering to me. In 15 of the top 20 largest democracies in the world now, we would classify the current leader of the country, the president or prime minister, as either a left-wing or a right-wing populist, okay? And I've given some examples here, both from the US and from abroad. So if you look abroad, AMLO, the president of Mexico, is definitely a left-wing populist in Mexico. It appears that his party Morena is about to win the presidential elections to be held in a couple of weeks, which will be a continuation of this regime. It is tightening, the race is tightening a bit, but it does appear. And it's interesting in that all opposition parties have come together under one opposition candidate, but they're unable to beat the populist candidate. In the US, certainly Bernie Sanders, AOC, would be considered. In Argentina, Kirchner, who was president and then after vice president, so she couldn't be put in jail. She was also a left-wing populist. Argentina has a history of populism on the left and on the right. They have a new president, Milei, who's a right-wing populist. He's the one who was running around the country with a chainsaw saying he was going to take out all these different departments and slash everything. Obviously in the US, Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orbán in Hungary. But this is a huge trend. And what I want to focus on is two things that happen with populism. One, both the left and the right, when you have left or right-wing populism, you tend to have protectionism, okay? And protectionism is just not good for anybody. Like David Ricardo figured this out in like the 18th century, and for some reason right now, even though we've gone 200 and something years with accepted economics that protectionism is bad for both the country that puts the tariff on and the country that has to import goods with the tariff, it's bad for everyone. Yet we, for some reason, are retesting this theory globally, both on the left and on the right. And that's bad, right? And it's bad for everybody because if you put a tariff on, your own citizens pay it. Like, don't let anybody on the left or the right tell you the tariffs are good because we're making this other country pay. That's the sad trick of tariffs, right? Is at the end of the day, if you buy the good, you pay the tariff, right? The tariff is after the good enters your country, right? So the company that is sending the good in from, let's say, Vietnam, they don't pay the tariff, right? They sold the good for 20 bucks. And the good arrives at the shores of the US, and we add a 50% tariff, and now it's 30 bucks, and then the retailer has to make something, so it's 35 bucks. You paid 35 bucks for something that you should have paid 25 bucks for. So basically, with the same amount of money in your pocket, you can buy less goods and services as the result of a tariff. Also, it creates distortions, right? Because the idea of kind of modern economic theory and trade policy is that every country should specialize in the goods that we are best at manufacturing or the services that we are best at providing. And that's how you maximize income for every country and every citizen in every country worldwide. The US produces really, really sophisticated technologies and aircraft engines, and that's why we have a very, very high standard of living, right? And that's good for us, right? And unfortunately for workers who've been displaced, and the US has not done a good job of retraining workers, which is what you need to do. Unfortunately, the US shouldn't produce textiles anymore or kind of aluminum or sort of very basic goods like that. Arguably, we shouldn't even really produce cars anymore, but there are some national security reasons for the US to continue to produce cars. But they're just not technologically, electric cars perhaps, but not traditional gas-powered cars. And so it hurts everybody, the workers in other countries, the workers in this country, it hurts everyone, consumers in all countries to have this trade war that we talked about. That's why you get the nearshoring. That's why there's the move from China to Mexico, right? These are all tied together. But the other concern about populism is what I alluded to earlier, which is that you promise people things on both the left or the right. You promise people things that sound good in the short term, okay? Like the concept of universal basic income, okay? Not criticizing, this is a more left-wing idea. It just factually, we can predict exactly what happens with universal basic income, right? The idea of universal basic income is you would give everybody like $12,000 in the country to buy groceries, to buy heating, electricity, things like that, right? Sounds like a great idea. The problem is exactly what happened when Evita is throwing the money in the movie happens with universal basic income. If the basket of goods in the country that it takes to live used to cost $50,000 and you give everybody $12,000, now the basket of goods will cost $62,000, right? And so the $12,000 just created inflation. It made everything more expensive and it doesn't actually help anyone. And inflation actually hurts the poorest the most because they have the least ability to react to price changes and the least ability to go and seek additional employment to pay higher cost, okay? So regardless, left or right, I think populism is a big threat. It's here to stay, okay? It's not people make it out like a US-based problem. It is not a US-based problem. I mean, the US does have an issue with it. I would not classify Biden as a populist, but certainly Sanders or AOC would be populist, and certainly Trump is a populist. But you've seen other countries have much longer issues with this, much bigger problems. Mexico's facing this, Brazil, Argentina, France has it with Marie Le Pen. You're seeing this in lots of different countries. This is not a US specific problem. Yeah, I don't know there's, she's like, Shawn, wrap it up. I've gotten my exercise for the day.
Sounds good.
And we'll just take one question because I got two more. I know none of you are going to believe number one. So we got to.
Quick question. Would you attribute the increase in populism to Gen Zs of millennials?
I think that there's been a lot of just general frustration. Populism tends to grow with a belief that the government does not pay attention to your concerns and your problems. And I think that on both the center right and center left, a lot of parties just said, well, Ricardo proved it. It's like done. We need to have free trade. That's just what we have to do. And countries didn't pay attention that even though free trade is the right thing, there are things you can do to soften the blow, like job retraining. And when you don't do that, and people are living in the Midwest and they used to have good manufacturing jobs, and then those manufacturing jobs go away, and those folks are 45, 50, 55 years old, they're not employable, and you didn't do anything to soften the blow, that even though, yes, it is right that those jobs probably should go to a country with a lower cost of labor, but we needed to create new opportunities. Like, we make a lot of aircraft engines in this country. The Midwest had very talented manufacturing employees. Why didn't we do that there, right? We could have. And so there was no thought about how do we replace these jobs that are going with jobs that would work with what the US should be making from a competitive advantage standpoint. And so that's why I think if you look, sort of the hotbed of populism in the US in some ways is that Rust Belt. And I think it's very much tied to the fact that there was no attention paid to, like, I think the elites on left and right said, well, this is what's supposed to happen in the country. And it was what was supposed to happen, but that doesn't mean you just like ignore the impact on people. And that was the concern. All right, so we'll get to number two. Number two was predictable, AI. You thought it was gonna be number one, but it's not, okay? I think AI is gonna be huge, okay? I think it's going to be smaller than what people think, because every time one of these things comes up, we always overstretch, right? We always think it's going to completely change life as we know it, right? 5 years ago, it was the metaverse. It's been cryptocurrency, right? So is AI going to be a huge help? Yes, it's going to be a huge help, right? Is it going to, again, change white-collar professions, professional jobs like law in a meaningful way? As a recovering lawyer, absolutely, it's going to change law, right? And I think it will help lawyers not do some of the tedious work that no lawyer I know enjoys doing, okay? But I do think we've overplayed our hand a little bit here, just like we've done with other trends in the past, but it's big, okay? Obviously, adoption rates, use of AI, this is just ChatGPT, this is from Pew and the US government. Use of ChatGPT,
highest amongst younger employees and younger citizens 18 to 29. But my cohort, the 30 to 49-year-olds, we're doing all right. Older folks not using so much AI yet, but that's happened with iPhones, right? iPhones first got adopted amongst the youngest consumers. They taught their parents, and then they taught their grandparents. That's likely to be what happens. One of the things I think is most exciting about AI is pattern recognition and the ability to recognize patterns in data that the human mind cannot see, or it would take huge amounts of effort for us to see. So, it is expected to be, a very big contributor to the economy. There are obviously questions about oversight and ethics, right? Like, will the machines become so smart that they could threaten us? And so we'll need some, important AI frameworks and global regulations. So I'm not going to take questions because I really want to get to number one. And then if you have any questions, we'll take them at the end. Are you ready? This is scary. This is something that happened this year that has never happened in the history of the world to date. Okay? Never happened in the entire history of the world to date. Demographic decline. Okay? For the first time, it is believed this year, we are producing less than 2.2 babies worldwide per woman. Okay? 2.2 is the replacement rate that is needed. If you want a stable population globally, you need to produce 2.2 on average. Of course, some people have 4 kids, some people have no kids, but on average per woman, because that's how they track it. I'm not being sexist, that's just how the data tracks it. It could be men too, either way, it's 2.2, okay? We need 2.2. It's just a little easier to track them all. So for the first time in history, it is believed that this year we have fallen below 2.2. The US is way below 2.2, okay? And the entire structure of society is designed for a growing population. The economy is set up that way. Retirement plans are set up that way. Social Security is set up that way. Everything in society is set up for the population to increase over time. Yes, there'll be peaks and valleys, okay? There'll be the boomers and then us tiny Gen Xers and then, the huge millennials, right? There'll be peaks and valleys, but in general, the population generally is supposed to increase. That is how we have structured all of society, but that is not what's happening anymore. If you look here, so this is the Democratic Republic of Congo. I just put that in there because they have the highest birth rate. Okay, this is live births. It does not mean the kids survive. Okay, so this is live births. So infant mortality would come out after this. Okay, so in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the average is 6 children, live births per woman. Okay, remember 2.2 is the replacement rate. It's between 2.2 and 2.1. Okay. US, UK, Italy, China, South Korea, all well below, which is why now the globe as a whole is believed this year, because we got a little reprieve during COVID because people were home and they didn't have a lot else to do, so they made some babies. And it was good for a couple of years there, but they've stopped. And if you want more on this, I had already made these slides, and I should have said at the beginning, many of you know Luke Albertson, my longtime teaching fellow, and he just won an award for being top teaching fellow this year, and we were super proud of him for that. He made these slides, so I gave him everything, but he made them look good. He always makes me look good. So I wanted to give him credit for that. But when he was looking at this, he was like, Shawn, this is crazy. I had him read this article called Suddenly There Are No More Babies, or something like that. If you just put suddenly and babies and Wall Street Journal, you will get the article. It came out in the last 4 or 5 days. So we had been preparing these slides, and he was freaked out, and I'm freaked out. And so I sent him this article when it came out 4 or 5 days ago, and it goes through there's a lot more. If you want a primer on this topic and why it's a huge issue, check that out. So what does this mean? It's really hard to get people to have more babies. So Japan, you may know, Japan has had 2 lost decades of economic growth, right? And Japan did everything in their power to get people to have more babies. Okay? Everything. Free childcare, free daycare, free birth, free everything. Anything, have babies, we'll give you cash. We will do anything. Please have babies. They could not get the birth rate up. They got it up a little bit and then it fell back down. They're under 1.0. And so this means that There's not enough money for retirees. There's not enough people to work in jobs to care for older sick people, okay? It means your economy is shrinking, so nobody wants to invest in your assets, like your real estate, your stocks, your bonds. So your economy kind of implodes. And Japan could not figure out a way. So in the US, the reason that we have not felt the fact that we're at 1.6 is immigration, right? I'm not here to dictate politics, but the reason the population of the US continues to increase is that even though our birth rate is too small to continue to increase, we have enough immigrants, legal and undocumented, to more than compensate for that 0.6 that we're missing in our birth rate. So before anybody gets so nervous about immigration, okay, it's actually kind of saved our patootie here in the US over the last couple of decades, because our birth rate has not kept up, but and that's in part why the US economy has been so strong, because other countries, particularly in Asia and Europe, that had similarly lower birth rates than the US did not have as much immigration. So their economies began to contract or to stagnate, as has happened in a lot of European countries, but that has not happened in the US. So global fertility has probably this year fallen below the replacement rate for the first time in human history. First time in human history, okay? This is going to require a whole rethinking of our social fabric, of our economics, okay? You may be sitting, or I may be sitting in the retirement home with an AI companion because there's no companion around to be my companion, okay? Like, I'm not kidding, like, people will probably have less care in their later years, less human care, and we will have to rely more on technology if we have a shrinking population. Okay, so on that happy note, I now turn you over to lunch, but adapt to these trends in the decade ahead. That is going to be the secret to success. I have so enjoyed our discussion today. Thank you so much to Jill, to Dean Coleman, to Lynn Larson, to Veronica for having me. It has really been my pleasure, and I will stick around for a little while to chat with anybody that has questions, but thank you so much. It's been a great opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Shawn. That was fascinating and such good topics of conversation for lunch. So just a couple of logistics. I want to mention that your ID today, this little tag ID, gets you into Harvard libraries that were contained in a list that was sent. We have that list at the desk. If you'd like to visit any of these throughout the day today, please do. They're spectacular, So we're going to have lunch on the second level here in Maxwell Dworkin. We will guide you there as we go. And then we will return back to this classroom, and there'll be a tour available later on. So much more fun to come. Thank you.